What is going on, guys? Andrew of New Bark Gaming back here, and welcome to today's episode of New Bark News. We're going to be starting off today's episode talking a little bit about a canceled Star Wars project from EA, where if you're like me, you'd never heard about it until you heard it was canceled, which kind of stinks since a lot of the concepts for this game sounded like they could have been pretty awesome. Back in 2013, EA signed a contract with Disney, essentially giving them the licensing for multiple Star Wars titles that they could make, basically involving the Star Wars characters, worlds, etc., which is pretty awesome for that company. It's given us Star Wars Battlefront as a relaunch, like a rebooted series for better or worse. I mean, the gameplay is fun, but then you have microtransactions and other stuff. Different topic for a different day. So jumping right into this, it started out under the development of a company by the name of Visceral, which is basically working under EA as one of their kind of like underling type of developers, and being headed by a woman by the name of Amy Hennig. Amy Hennig is of fame of working on the Uncharted franchise, and this game was supposed to be about like a bounty hunter exploring some of the roguish type of parts of Star Wars, being a little bit more open world, adventure, single player type of thing. It sounded absolutely incredible from the little bit of information I was able to get in this leaked article here. And it just sounds great. You know, the idea of being able to play through a cinematic game along the lines of an Uncharted, but in the Star Wars universe, it sounds like the type of thing we've been kind of looking for in a single player Star Wars game for a long time now. Now, Amy Hennig did state that it was going to be spiritually similar to Uncharted, but feature its own unique gameplay. Nonetheless, it sounded like it was in really good hands. Unfortunately, Visceral Studios ended up tanking, which means their parent company, EA, had to come in and try and do what they could do with it. Now, knowing EA, what did they want to probably focus on? It was extending player time, is what they put it in quotes, but that basically seemed to translate into giving more of a multiplayer focused experience with an open world type of aesthetic. So, bearing that in mind, what does that probably yield given the little bit of information we knew about the bounty hunters and such? To me, that basically spells out they were going to be making a game along the same lines as Destiny, only with some Star Wars skins slapped on it. Especially considering they had already tried sort of the traditional MMO type of a game with Star Wars The Old Republic not too long ago. Now, granted, that wasn't EA, but that game still more or less flopped, which writes out that the market for it's probably a little bit sour at this point. So all being said and done, it kind of stinks that these games aren't going to be being developed any further. On the bright side, if you're a Star Wars fan like myself, EA is working on a Star Wars third-person action game by the name of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order from the same studio that made Titanfall, so hopefully that can be good. I didn't play either Titanfall game. I heard the first one was awful, but the second one was really good, but nobody bought it because the first one left such a bad taste in its mouth. So we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. I'm hoping if EA continues to yield mediocre Star Wars titles, Disney might think a little bit more before they do their next licensing deal for the Star Wars games, because back in like 2005 and such, we used to get some really, really stellar titles under the Star Wars name, such as Star Wars Republic Commando like I'm showing on screen right now. So let's go ahead and move on to our second story. And this one's going to have to do with what I believe to be one of the most underappreciated consoles of the past 10 years, and that's the Sony's PlayStation Vita. This was a console that the company, I just feel like, didn't get behind quite strong enough after its first couple years of launch, but is a really cool piece of hardware. Now, in recent years, this thing's come into much bigger notoriety for being a really good emulation device if you hack it. One of the problems with that is once you update the firmware to a certain level, the hacks are no longer compatible with it, and there's no way to back update the firmware. So where does that come into play today? Well, we're on firmware update 3.69 until yesterday, then Sony dropped firmware update 3.7. Interestingly enough, if you look at the system software like notes for what came in the firmware update, it says this system software update improves system performance. How vague. It doesn't really seem to be adding any features there if you ask me. So with that being the case, it says to me that they're basically doing it as another anti-hacking measure, which it is Sony's legal right to do so. They're essentially protecting their intellectual property and their copyrights, given how some of the hacks were famous for like downloading all PSP games or PS1 games. So these are things that do directly affect Sony as a company, at least in theory. And on top of that, we are also aware that, at least supposedly, the people who did the hacks for earlier firmware updates had one prepared for the previous firmware before the one that came out yesterday for version 3.69 that they were kind of just keeping in their back pockets until Sony completely abandoning updating the firmware for the Vita. Well, with this new update coming out, that kind of acts as another obstacle for further hacking, and this also coincides well with Sony's history of trying to protect their property. Once more, it's their legal right to do so. So with all that being said, guys, I do think the Vita is still a great system, and nothing against Sony there. I do back the company a lot. I think they've been doing a great job with consoles here in recent years. So this is just meant as a little bit of a disclaimer for those of you who are looking to get a Vita for modding purposes. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and move on to our third story. This one's going to be directed primarily towards Switch owners in that the app called VLC, which is essentially a media player, maybe being ported to Switch soon. Now, this started off as a really flexible app that could be used on PCs to play different like media forms such as video files, right? And then it was eventually adapted for the Xbox One. Pretty easy transition there, given how the Xbox One's functions rather similarly to a computer. And now there's a lot of talks of bringing it over to the Switch. Now, just a media player, right? Sounds like it's probably not that impressive of news, but in its current state, the Switch is kinda terrible for playing back video and such. Now, I'm someone who adores the Switch, but I do acknowledge there are a lot of limitations there. I mean, in terms of streaming services right now on the Switch, you don't even really have access to Netflix. So having something like this, where you could essentially download videos to your SD card or something like that on your computer, then pop it into the Switch, use the media player app, and watch movies on it and those types of things on the go, is really awesome. It essentially makes the Switch much closer to being a fully functional tablet and gaming system in one, which I think is something that Nintendo's console could really benefit from. I know sales are already good for it, but this would just kind of add to its level of depth and its ability to get to a broader audience of appeal. There's also comments about VLC possibly coming to the PlayStation 4, although it's not quite as needed there given how on PlayStation 4 you have access to a much wider variety of streaming services to begin with, in addition to the PlayStation 4 having its own media player. So this is just some neat news to possibly improve the overall flexibility of the Switch as a system, particularly as a handheld for doing things on the go over a Wi-Fi network, given how most of the time you'd probably be watching like Netflix or movies or whatever on your TV rather than necessarily through your Switch when you're at home. This also opens up the possibility to like download digital files from movies onto an SD card or whatever, pop that into your Switch, play it back through your Switch through your TV, which is another big plus there. So kind of some neat little add-on features there. So moving right on to our last article of the day, guys, we're going to be talking a little bit about some Nintendo stuff, and that is that Nintendo is adding more games to their Nintendo Selects line. Now, this was initially launched with the Wii, Wii U, and Nintendo 3DS in mind, and unfortunately, out of those three consoles, the only one that's still remaining is the 3DS. But on the bright side, they're bringing Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask and Super Mario Maker to the lineup, as well as Star Fox 64 3D. And all three of these games are pretty awesome from what I hear. I played the original version of Majora's Mask a little bit. Problem was I went through like 3 different copies on the N64, all of which didn't have functional saves. But the little bit I played of that gameplay was awesome. Star Fox 64 3D, I got a really big kick out of when it first came out for the 3DS. It was one of those first early titles for the system that really sold me on maybe getting one, since I did find it to be a blast to play. And then Super Mario Maker obviously has gotten a lot of critical acclaim for being a really well-structured Mario game from Nintendo, providing a lot of flexibility for those playing the games, and these now being marked down to $19.99 is awesome because it makes them much more available to a wide variety of consumers, especially considering the 3DS does seem like it is beginning to approach the end of its console life. So with all that being said, guys, that's going to wrap up today's episode of New Bark News. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome, and I'll catch you guys next time with some more video game news.